So, Joe, it's a delight to have you as part of this series. I'm glad that you could do it. And this theme of the future is calling us to greatness. I look forward to seeing where we go on this theme.
Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation and really honestly humbled that you invited me to participate. So thanks so much.
Well, Joe, I actually I don't want you, I hope you're not humbled too much, because right now I'm going to ask you to sort of really help us get a sense, because not everybody's going to be familiar with you or your work. So those viewers or listeners who don't know who Joe Brewer is, those of us who do think that you're awesome, we want you to share with them who is Joe Brewer, and what brings you to this conversation? Like, brag on yourself. Like, how did you get into this, and what are you well known for? What are you passionate about? What are you committed to?
Cool. Well, I guess I'd start by saying what I'm well known for is having a contagious energy and positive outlook on life. And I channel that energy into a rather eclectic academic background that has enabled me to do something that very few other people on the planet seem to be doing so far. So I'm trying to help them do it too. So, brief background on me. I like to start by saying I was born and raised on a chicken farm in rural Missouri before the internet, of course. So by the time I went to college on a full ride scholarship, I was just starving to study whatever the hell I could get my hands on that wasn't available in my bodunk little town. And so at the university, I studied physics, philosophy, applied mathematics, theater and performing arts. I did theater and dance, and ended up in a place where I was studying what's called complexity science, originally chaos theory, and then later the study of complex adaptive systems. And interestingly, ended up in a graduate program in atmospheric science, studying cloud formation, which it turns out is the biggest uncertainty in climate models, is how do clouds respond. And what I was really interested in, though, was how do patterns arise when there are a lot of interacting parts, and the patterns that arise are not directly linked to any one driving factor. So it's really the convergence of all of them together. So taking that kind of a way of thinking about things, I moved from the physical sciences into the cognitive and social sciences, have blazed my own path. I like to say I have an informal PhD from Joe University in cognitive semantics. So I've studied psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, anthropology, evolutionary biology, and a host of other fields to try to understand how human thought and behavior work, and especially how cultural systems change in time, so that we can eventually put on our design hats and change cultural systems the way that we want them. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years has been building in that direction. And now I'm very excited to be in the midst of laying the foundations for a field of culture design for evolving civilization with intention. So it's kind of me in a nutshell.
That's great. Well, that was a great introduction, and I'm curious because one of the things that actually on your Skype thing says, I'm involved in a climate meme project, and so it says ask me about it. So hey, I'll bite.
Okay, so first of all, let me say what a meme is for the viewers that aren't familiar. The term meme is basically a way of thinking about culture as if it's like biology. So in biology, we have evolution, and evolution involves genes, which are basically scripted programs within the cells of our bodies that help us make new bodies when we create offspring. And the concept of a meme just says, well, similarly, there are things in culture that can arise and be mimicked or imitated by other people, and then spread and become normal in the same way that genes can spread across an ecosystem by the reproduction and the viability of a species. So the Climate Meme Project was really looking at the conversation about global warming through this unique lens. And so what we did was we gathered a large number of which you could think of as like snippets of thought, little stories, beliefs, attitudes that people have about global warming. We ended up with about 1,500 unique thought constructs. So an example of this, just to make it concrete, if someone says, it's a New Year's Day and it's sunny outside, thank you, global warming, for ruining the holidays, that would be a meme. That's a little story with an implicit judgment and a belief, and it's something that one person could say and then another person could share it or repeat it. Mm-hmm. And so we gathered a large collection of these, and then we did a pretty sophisticated kind of multi-step analysis. And what we were looking for was what really drives the conversation about global warming, and why is it that more people don't act on this issue? And so what we found was quite fascinating, because it really explained that. And so now we know why the conversation about global warming is broken. And when I say why, I mean with rich psychological detail. And we started using the insights from that work to start to design different memes or different stories or behaviors that we think are more likely to spread solutions to global warming without getting stuck in the rut of what is really a totally broken conversation.
Wow. Well, that's so fascinating. I just got to basically say, follow your heart. Like, help us get more into that. What have you learned? Where do you see this making a positive contribution? Because what you just said, it's got me fired up.
So one thing that we learned was that there are these things, we call them resonance points in the conversation. A resonance point is basically like a wave pattern that if you speak in a way or act in a way that's similar to it, then you'll get resonance. Just like how you can get resonance in, say, a bridge where there's like a wind blowing across it, and it creates a vibrational pattern, then the vibration can become stronger. And the same way, there are beliefs or attitudes in the conversation that if you speak to them, you'll get a response. Mm-hmm. And so one of those that was really telling was what we called the survival dimension. And survival dimension is basically that within the conversation about global warming, people kind of had views that ranged from total extinction of all humans and possibly all life on Earth, up to the slightly more positive, but still really negative, Mad Max apocalyptic future of collapse of our civilization. And so what we found was, psychologically speaking, the entire conversation spanned this range of horrible things. And so what that tells us is a couple of things. It tells us that the underlying belief is that human beings are bad for the planet. It'll be a good thing if we are wiped out. It's like we're this plague or this virus that's really destructive. And so if we believe that humans are bad, then how can we possibly be optimistic about what we can do to make the world better? It's not even on the table. Right. So when we saw that belief was driving that part of the conversation, we realized the antidote is to flip the belief. Instead of humans are the problem, it's humans are actually inherently good. And we have the opportunity, you could use different stories. You could say we could rise to our true selves, follow our better angels. There are different stories we could tell, different specific memes, but all of them suggesting that humans can be stewards for the planet, that we can be the earth knowing and loving itself, that we can be the intelligence system that takes learnings from biology and applies it to our own social systems. So urban design based on biomimicry and those sorts of things. But we can never have that conversation or engage in those activities if we start with the assumption that humans are bad and they need to go away. Yeah. So that's a kind of the richness, the psychological richness of what we saw.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's what you're pointing to is one of the reasons why I am a big history evangelist, that I share the globally evidenced produced, that is the first creation story that we have that's globally produced and evidence-based, of who we are, who we're related to, because I find this big picture, physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution, as our modern day common creation story, that frame itself helps us situate ourselves. Who is the human? Are we just this blight on the planet that the planet would be better off without us, or are we the universe becoming conscious of itself, that we're not so much evil as we are young? We just don't, the Earth has not been thinking self-reflexively. The universe has not been thinking, at least in this solar system, self-consciously and very long. We're just just begun. So how do we then come into integrity, into alignment with right relationship to reality, given this process, but given a larger, greener sense of who we are?
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you voiced
Totally. And right along those lines, I love the book that Edward Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, has put out recently. Came out maybe 2 years ago, called The Social Conquest of Earth.
Yes, I like it.
I'm sure you're familiar with it. And one of the things that I love about that book that is a building block of what you've just said is that he makes the case for how hypersocial behavior, the ability to create a society of individuals that have special kinds of economic diversity, like ants or bees that can have different roles within their community, that the only animal to have that type of social pattern that is also based in empathy, meaning it even has a brain that is capable of processing empathy, is humans. Yeah. The humans are the only animal on the planet that has all of the right ingredients to be this hypersocial organism. We can create societies with varied parts and cooperate to achieve things that are bigger and more diverse than any of us can do on our own. And that we are wired from the very basis of our existence to have empathy and connection. And it starts with the parent-child relationship, that mothers having the biological connection to the new life growing in their uterus, all the way through to the decade or more of social role modeling and learning for our brains to even function at a basic level in society, and so on. All of that information that confirms scientifically what you just said, that we are this statistically speaking, it's like the odds are about 10 to the power of 20 against something like us emerging again. And 10 to the power of 20, that's 10 with 20 zeros behind it, is a really damn big number, meaning that there's a really small chance that anything like that will happen again in, say, the next 100 million years or billion years of life on this earth. So this is kind of our one shot. And so we need to really embrace what it means to be human and take those scientific insights that validate the inherent goodness of humans, like the way that our brains are wired for empathy and the way that parent-child rearing is emblematic of how social and cooperative we are, and so on. All of that stuff is definitely part of the way that we convince ourselves of our inherent goodness.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Bringing up Edward O. Wilson's book, The Social Conquest of Earth, reminds me also of two other people that have written recently. David Sloan Wilson, of course, one of the leading evolutionary theorists who's written a lot on the evolutionary significance of religion and adaptive behavior and the roles that religion has played in helping us cooperate at larger scale than kin altruism and
his book, Dark Cathedral, is really wonderful.
It's fabulous. But Jonathan Haidt also, in his New York Times bestselling book, The Righteous Mind, I often recommend chapters 9 through 12 are, I think, the best articulation of the evolutionary significance of religious meaning-making systems for helping us cooperate at those scales that I've ever encountered.
Yeah, and when we think about religious meaning-making systems, the ones that we live with now are actually not churches. They're not Catholicism or Islam. And those are still with us, but in many ways, they're ideological systems that are based on kind of warrior chieftain nation state agrarian societies with centralized top-down authoritarian hierarchies. And of course they've evolved quite a lot since then, but that's a still core piece of how they're institutionally made up. The big ones today, the kind of religious or belief systems of today, are actually corporate brands, things that grew out of public relations and marketing. So when we talk about Coca-Cola or Harley Davidson or Apple Computers, Google, these brand constructs, what are they? They're meaning-making systems that help us bring together and mobilize huge numbers of people to achieve complex goals. And at the level of the social system, they perform a lot of the same functions as our legacy of religious institutions. Of course, they don't fill the same niche, so they don't work in exactly the same way. But just recognizing them as systems of meaning and the capacity for a coordinated activity. I mean, we can even go a little bit more general and say that the entire digital communications infrastructure of the internet and mobile phones is operating like an implicit shared belief system, a shared belief system in decentralized autonomous communication which is anti-authoritarian at a fundamental level in the way that it's architected. And so looking at the way that the evolutionary biologists like David Sloan Wilson and Edward Wilson, of which two, of course, are not related, as you know, um, and John Haidt in his work on political psychology, that we can see the potential to unleash these amazing tools of human cooperation. I mean, the greatest tools of human cooperation in recent history, meaning the last 10,000 years, are religions, and then market systems, and then multinational corporations, and centralized, then increasingly decentralized governments. And so we're in a place now where the newest sector of society, it's only been with us for a few hundred years, and has only matured in the last 20 to 30 years, is civil society. And now we have the communications and manufacturing infrastructure for a decentralized economy of civil society. And that is what Jeremy Rifkin has been talking about in his story about zero marginal cost societies in his new book, that we're now at a place where we can have this distributed systems of meaning, and they have all of the benefits of cooperation and large-scale collective action that our religious systems have had for millennia, but appropriate to the complexity of our global civilization.
Yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, I just started, I just ordered the audiobook of Jeremy Rifkin's latest book, and I'm only in like chapter 2 at this point.
Yeah.
So, Joe, what are some of the challenges when you look at what we're currently dealing with, and what the decades ahead are likely to bring? What do you see as the greatest challenges that humanity will face? And then what do you think is the most helpful responses to those? Some things that may already are being done, but maybe need to be done in a bigger way or better way or more ecological way or whatever. But some of the things that aren't yet being done that really need to be. So two-part question.
I think that I'll start with big challenges. I'll pick two because we could talk for a while about them. But one that I think others may not be commenting on is I'll call it the problem of smoke and mirrors, which is that we all live within our own filters of interpretation, our own beliefs, value judgments, perceptions, and all of that. And with the advent of the internet and decentralized communications, one of the benefits is that people can form tribes around shared belief. But one of the problems is people can form tribes around shared belief. And we have a loss of authoritative expertise. Not authoritarian, but authoritative, meaning legitimate knowledge. That now people can easily have a belief, find a presumed expert who shares that belief, treat it like it's legitimate, and just get caught up in these echo chambers of conversation and not discern what is real. So I think the smoke and mirrors problem, if I had to pick one word, I'd say it's a problem of discernment. The ability to discern what is actually going on. And a good example of this is the anti-vaccine discussion, where there's this peer-reviewed article is published in The Lancet in the late 90s, suggesting a link between vaccines and autism. Turns out, we learned just last year that the guy cooked his books and that it was a fake study, but it had all the air of legitimacy. And now there has been several decades of growing discussion in these tribal communities around anti-government distrust of big pharma, and feeding that into an anti-vaccine discussion. And it's really difficult to unlock people from those strongly held beliefs. So that smoke and mirrors problem keeps us from seeing real problems and working to solve them in a way that actually has efficacy. So I think that's a big issue.
I think so too.
Another one that is related to that is the problem, I'll call it the problem of tribalism, because we also have the solution of tribalism, which is using the same mechanisms. But as you know from studying human evolution, if there's like one thing we could say about humans, we are wired in every single way to naturally and automatically form groups. And we have all of these implicit biases that are very important for us to think that my group is better than your group. And we've seen lots of psychology studies and sociology studies showing this. So we form tribes so naturally. That means that we very easily become insular and divided and polarized. And there's a strength to that because it creates a diversity of opinions and diversity of views. And I think that diversity is incredibly important from an innovation perspective. Right. But one of the challenges is that it's very difficult to have concerted action when it's needed. Like, let's say that we wanted to dismantle the fossil fuel infrastructure and all of the corruption in government that's associated with it so that we could transition fully into renewable energy, which is something we desperately need to do.
Right.
We already have the smoke and mirrors problem that I mentioned earlier, which includes climate skepticism and climate denial, which has all been fabricated through public relations to confuse people about authoritative science. But we also have the problem of lots of people that are in their own issue groups battling and competing and not able to come together to address the strategic issues. So, like, as an example, in progressive politics in the US, people are working, debating about reproductive rights for women, and they're looking at environmental issues, and this list that goes on and on and on. But if they all came together and dealt with something like corporate personhood or dismantling the tax haven system that conceals literally tens of trillions of dollars of stealing, of theft every single year, these large systemic issues, then we can't address those systemic issues. And so this siloing effect, which is so natural and innate to the way that our minds work and the way that we form communities, is a big obstacle or challenge for us to overcome.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Wow.
So I just talked about the problems. I should talk about the solutions.
Yeah.
I think that one thing we can acknowledge about the modern era, roughly from the 14th century forward, is that we have created increasingly effective trans-tribal identities, meaning where there would be a place where there were several tribal identities, and then they would form a larger integrative shared identity. So the nation state, the corporation, regional economies, and now we have things like metropolitan areas, which are basically conglomerations of cities and towns. And these abilities that we have to introduce something like cosmopolitanism, where we can see a similarity at a higher identity level while maintaining diversity at a lower identity level. So, for example, I might be a white male from the United States living in Seattle, Washington, but I can collaborate with a female with dark skin in India who's part of some tribal group there in, say, North India. And she and I can work together for something that's about common humanity. And so we can have diversity of identity at one level and a collaborative identity at another level.
Yeah.
So I think that this smoke and mirrors problem and this tribalism and kind of issue siloing that comes with it can be addressed by having really good storytelling that creates a kind of a foundation of shared sentiment and shared perspective that maintains the diversity that's needed. And probably the best example of this in the world is the story of the United States. The myth of America. And I mean myth in both the sense that it's a cultural narrative of origins and history and identity, and also myth in that it's not entirely true. But it doesn't need to be entirely true. When I travel the world, I see that the American dream is a story that is very much alive in places like Tanzania or Zanzibar or Kenya or Bolivia and other places. It's just as much theirs as it is mine. It's not a birthright of physical locale. And yet that story is one of celebrating the bringing together of diversity in a common story of discovery and progress. And like I said, it's a myth. It's not entirely true. And in some ways, it's egregiously misleading. But it's an example of a trans-tribal shared tribal identity. Many different subgroups come together to form a higher level integrated group. And it's worked in that way. Yeah. The European Union is an example of this that's created a governing system around it. And so I think examples like this are suggestive. And certainly multinational corporations that have offices in 50 or 100 countries are doing the same thing as well. So I think that we've figured out a lot of how to do this. Mm-hmm. It's just taking the learnings of how it's been done before and applying it strategically to solve key global challenges in the next few decades.
Yeah, yeah. What you're saying reminds me of a quote I used to have memorized, I'm sure I'll butcher it, from Thomas Berry, where he says something along the lines of, the main task of the immediate future is to assist in the intercommunion of all living and non-living beings in a way that further affirms and enhances the unique identity and distinctions of each. So it's that both.
Yeah, and that's like the American story when it is actually at its best, does that extremely well.
Mm.
Like where I live in Seattle, we have people from 100 different countries all coming here and working for our big companies like Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon or Starbucks, REI, and these things, and they share a lot of similarity while maintaining an incredible amount of diversity.
Yeah.
And at a more mundane level, just look at job descriptions. Someone who is trained in marketing, someone who's trained in organizational management, someone who's trained in visual design, someone who can create software, someone who can facilitate groups, et cetera, et cetera. We create these communities of diversity with shared agendas and shared purposes and shared aspirational identities,
Mm-hmm.
calling us to be our better selves.
Mm-hmm.
We do this all the time. But what we don't do is we don't observe the ways that we do this all the time and then apply it strategically to things like the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if we do this better, if we get better at this collectively, then we can change things much more quickly than we have so far.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Well, Joe, when you wake up on a given day, or it's a Monday morning and you're looking at your week, what is it that you personally find soul nourishing, mission nourishing? What inspires you on a day by day, week by week basis in the face of some really scary stuff?
I learned something a long time ago before I got caught up in all the global crises, and then I forgot it and then remembered it later. And that is that the greatest nourishment of the soul is to surround yourself with people that you think are better than you. Said differently, if you surround yourself with inspiring people, you're going to live an inspired life.
Yeah.
And the greatest joy of my work and the greatest joy of my personal life is that my work and personal life are not separate.
Yes.
I did this on purpose so that I'm constantly surrounded by smart, creative, inspiring, beautiful, compassionate people from everywhere on the planet. And actually, my job when I go and speak at conferences, it's not the content. Like I come and talk about applied memetics or cognitive linguistics or whatever. It's not that. The thing that I actually bring is a perspective that I see inspiring things happening everywhere. And I can confirm it because I'm friends with people in all of those places.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'll say things like, well, I've got this friend who lives in northern Italy, and his name is this, and this is what he's doing, and it's awesome. And I've got this other friend in Brazil, and her name is this, she's doing this, and it's awesome. And so by surrounding myself with these people every day, I see people that are physically active and healthy, people that go to visit beautiful places and go and do things in the outdoors. I do this myself. People that really enjoy food, people that really like sitting down to a good meal, people who really enjoy music. And I enjoy all of these things. So when I see others that are working hard and doing the good work, but also living what I see as a quality life, then that just reinforces for me that this is what I should be doing.
Yes.
And then I do it, and I feel nourished every single day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, amen. I mean, that's one of the places where I feel a real soul or a kinship or collegiality with you is that people will often, sort of, when they find out, if they haven't known what Connie and I have been doing for the last 12 years, and they find out, wait a second, you've been effectively homeless for 12 years, living out of the generosity of other people, without an apartment, without a home or anything else, what are you guys, crazy? And yet we have the actual subjective experience, our felt experiences that we're the richest people in the world, because we get to do what we do, what we're, like follow our bliss. We're both following our bliss in a way that's deeply nourishing to each other. And we've fortunately calibrated to each other such that we have a really great, thriving, juicy, wonderful, heartful, mission-centered marriage. But we also are always in the context of other people. So the people that we stay with as we travel North America for now 12 years are often people who are very bright, well-read, heartful, compassionate, generous, deeply committed to a healthy future kind of people. And because we're not there year round, we get to interact with them for several days to a week or two, and then we're on to other people. So we're also able to play this cross-fertilizing role of sharing what this person's doing over here with what these people are doing over there. And I mean, we often say we're richer than kings. We actually feel like we are richer
Absolutely.
than kings, that we get to do this work at this time in history with each other and do it this way, even though we're technically homeless, you know.
Yeah, I had this great experience last year where I traveled the world for a month. I started in Seattle and I went to San Diego. Then from San Diego, I went to Tanzania and Zanzibar. Then I went to upstate New York, and then I came back to Seattle. In that month of time, the amount of money I was compensated for my work was exactly the same as the money I spent traveling, meaning that I had net zero money. And what I realized was that the money was like so secondary. I had this amazing experience of abundance, traveling and meeting people and going to things like, I went to where the fossil remains of Lucy, Australopithecus boisei, where that was found. I got to go to the Serengeti. I got to go to Stonetown and look at the apartment where Freddie Mercury was born. I have these like experiences that were just super cool. And I got to like stand at the altar where the East African slave trade was ended by Sir David Livingstone. These kinds of experiences. And money did not exchange hands, or at least it didn't for me. Mm-hmm. Someone paid money to someone else to cover my travel for me to do all of this. And at the end of the day, I was $0 richer in money, but immeasurably richer in life experience. Absolutely. And so it's a good reminder how skewed a lot of the simplistic thinking is about our economy and what is real value. Yeah. And one of the big paradigm shifts that we're in the middle of right now in terms of economic thinking is moving away from exclusive financial measures to things like, the national happiness metric coming out of Bhutan and other things like that, that suggest that a really well-lived life is enriched because of social experience and personal health and the ability to seek and learn and grow. And there's a level of money that's needed for that, but it's impressively low and accessible for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And living a life of tremendous joy and happiness and fulfillment does not require that we have a carbon-rich or carbon-intensive lifestyle, nor does it require the kinds of things that have not ordinarily been associated with wealth. One can actually live rather simple and yet feel like they are richer than kings and have that experience.
Yeah, there's this amazing difference in complexity science between the difference between complex and complicated, and on the other side, the difference between simple and simplistic. So the difference between complex and complicated. Complicated is something that's hard to achieve, hard to understand. It's hard to pull off. So like creating the rocket thruster for the space shuttle, that's complicated. Something that's complex is something that is surprising and unexpected, but happens so easily it's almost for free. So you start heating up the air over the surface of the ocean, and pretty soon you're going to get a thunderstorm. Very complex set of things that have to happen. But in a way, you kind of got it for free. The system just moved into its lowest energy state at every step along the way, and the storm arose and the storm dissipated. Same thing for the difference between simple and simplistic. Simple, a lot of things that are complex are actually simple at the same time, because think about simple, like the ability to be happy is actually an emergent state in your life. And the way to get to a place of happiness is to remove all the complications.
Yes.
But notice how this is not about being simplistic, it's about being wise. And being wise is about following the path of complexity. Basically letting the system of your life create joy for you and don't get in its way.
Yeah.
So this is why these concepts from complexity science are so helpful for keeping in mind that a simple life is not simplistic.
Yeah.
And it can be full of richness because it enables complexity to arise, because complexity is not about being complicated.
Right.
And then there you have it.
Yeah. Well, this is bringing up is actually a conversation I just had with Connie yesterday, because one of the most important decision places that we always have is the decision of what context, what environment we will place ourselves, both natural context and social context. And that's really where she sees the emphasis in terms of free will, the whole do humans have free will and what's the nature of free will and what's the nature of choice. All that is, I think, secondary. Certainly it is to Connie, because the most important choice that we have in any moment and on any day and any season of our life is what context will we put ourselves in, because the context, natural and social, that we put ourselves in, elicits us. That's what creates us. That's what draws us forth. I mean, I often say that the environment is not our surroundings, it's our source and it's our sustenance. I mean, what we today call the environment, the ancients called God. I mean, we're talking about the fertile context of our being that draws us forth in ways that we wouldn't have been drawn forth before. And I think that's one of the things that many times when somebody dies, we just read yesterday or just in the last few days, we read something somewhere. I think it might have been in the New York Times about this nature of part of the grief when somebody dies is that who you are, if that was a close relationship, you showed up in a way in relationship to that person in a way that was unique, that you didn't show up in that way with other people. And there's both the grief of the loss of that person, but there's also, I think at some deep level, the grief of of a part of you that may not show up that same way again because you don't have that context eliciting that.
Absolutely. And one of the things from childhood development and the psychology of early childhood development, there's this very important concept of intersubjectivity, which is that we become who we are as graded levels of seeing ourselves as different from, but in relation to another. Mm-hmm. So when I'm 6 months old and I'm being held against my mother's bosom, I literally cannot tell the difference between her skin and my own. All I do is I feel warmth and affection. And the boundary of warmth and affection does not exist in the way my brain understands it. But there comes a point somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, roughly for the typical person, where we start to create this boundary of empathy, where empathy is literally the ability to see two perspectives in that experience instead of one, my perspective and my mother's perspective. And so this ability to be me is partly an extension of being someone else and then being not someone else as a kind of differentiation. And so in the same way as we become our adult selves, everyone's identity is actually a community. There is a tribe of Michael Dowd, and I mean that literally in your head. You are a collection of identities that is really an interwoven tapestry of relationships. And that's just true for every one of us. So just like there's no autonomous, rational actor in economics, there is no autonomous individual self in the human mind. And of course, the Buddhist mystics knew this 2,500 years ago. This idea of a singular self is illusory. If you take the time to just observe the self in action, meditation, you will quickly see that you have many different selves in many different moments. Yeah. And while there is continuity across it, there's also a lack of continuity. It changes distinctly. And that's because we are a web of relationships.
Yeah. Well, and when you add to that sort of our microbiome self, yes. The fact that we have all these other creatures with their own DNA that we wouldn't exist without them, that again, sort of the skin encapsulated ego that myself stops here and doesn't include all of that and all of the community of what you were just now speaking of. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting to me when we think about the opportunity we have now going toward the middle of the 21st century. It's 2014 and we're moving forward in time, is that this kind of insight is now becoming ubiquitous in the scholarly world. Every single domain of research, whether it's humanities or science or whatever, is taking a systemic view. Mm-hmm. It's taking an integrative view. We've moved beyond several hundred years of analysis, which basically means break it into simpler parts because that's the only way to deal with it, to put the pieces together and see what happens when the parts come together. Yeah. So this is the way every domain of scholarly work is done now and has been for at least 20 years. If you go into study English literature, you will take an emergent view of integrating the pieces. If you go study media and communications, the same thing. Religious studies, same thing. Anthropology, physics, chemistry, whatever. And so what that means is that we're now riding this wave of shift from seeing the world in a break it down into the separate parts sort of way, to see the world as how the parts come together and look at the patterns and flows. And when we see the patterns and flows, we start to see something that gives me a great deal of hope. And that is that we start to see the pattern of transformation within our civilization. Yeah. So rather than seeing it as this linear sequence of carbon dioxide building up and we're not doing anything about it and it's getting worse, or poverty becoming more chronic and getting worse, whatever the problem is, we start to see that there is an awakening. There's a realigning of sentiment and action. There are new kinds of communities and new tools for creating community. And that we're actually accelerating the expression of compassionate collective action in a way that, even 5 years ago, when a lot of people still didn't understand that Wikipedia was a legitimate economic model. I think about it, like, you're going to do something for free and ask tens of thousands of people to put in hundreds of hours of hard work to build a global repository of knowledge for no money whatsoever. Even 5 years ago, a lot of economists thought that that was not physically possible. Well, oops, Wikipedia exists. And same thing with the way that we're now seeing this decentralized energy production with 3D printers, the rise of the do-it-yourself culture and hacker-maker spaces, and the plummeting cost of solar panels and various other energy sources, like having bacteria that's basically digesting your garbage in your house and producing all the energy in your house. That all of this stuff is happening in tiny pockets everywhere. And if we take a piecemeal approach, we don't see how it's all converging on the same thing. The thing that it's converging toward is a macroorganism where our civilization begins to behave in the same way that our bodies are made up of all of these different species that are collaborating. Basically, you could think of macroeconomics the last 500 years has been us doing that badly. And now we're finally doing it well. We now have the ability for communication to happen quickly enough in the system that the system can nourish itself at the global scale. I mean, think about the human body, how your hemoglobin goes around, and the hemoglobin is what makes the blood cells red, and it's what stores oxygen and moves it around to nourish the body. If your circulatory system cannot provide oxygen to every cell in your body every single moment, then your body goes away. That is a thermodynamic problem. The question is, can you distribute this nutrient in a way that is energy efficient enough that it's physically possible to do? Well, before the digital communications infrastructure, we could not communicate on a global scale fast enough to allocate resources where they needed to go in a way that the system could operate as a macroorganism, which is why it's only just happening now. But we would not even see that pattern converging if we were taking a reductionist approach.
Wow, this is so great. I mean, you're actually reminding me of a book I read 15 years ago or 14 years ago, Joel DeRosnay, The Symbiotic Man, where he talked about humans. It should have been titled The Symbiotic Human, but humans, our technology and nature, that we're creating a cell or an organism at the scale of the planet, that we're like creating it from the inside. That's what this conversation is reminding me of. Well, Joe, I know we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to ask you a question that Connie has just requested I ask everybody, which is that if you could have dinner with three of the most amazing people in human history, that all four of you are together at a dinner party, or if you invited three amazing people at any time in history to share a beer or a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or whatever, or a meal, who would those three people be, and why would you invite them?
Oh, it's a great question. This is the kind of question that I'll answer now, and then 10 minutes from now I'll have a different answer. It's just such a great question. So one of those people would be Buckminster Fuller.
Yes.
Because he had a truly unique mind in the way that he went about learning, because he was mostly self-taught, which is why his reading is so esoteric and difficult for people to understand. That he just did not think the way that anyone else around him has, and no one does now. I don't think it's possible to produce another Buckminster Fuller, at least not just like him. So I think he would be a fascinating one. And it'd be really cool to bring him together with, let's see here, I think Jesus' mother. We know so little about the historical Jesus because it was all written down decades after he died. You could tell he was a pretty amazing human being, but there's really a lot we don't know. But what would it be like to be either his mother or his possibly wife, if he really was married to Mary Magdalene, but one of them, a woman who was in a place of great significance, whose cultural memory has been destroyed. because I would want that female perspective on what's happening now based on what was happening in her life. I
Yeah.
think that would be really powerful. And her with Bucky would be pretty cool. And I guess for the third one, gosh, this is really tough. Um, I think, actually, it'd be really interesting to have a conversation with one of the great, like bring in one of the great conquerors, whether it's Genghis Khan or Napoleon, those people who really understood power and even violent power. And I'm not an endorser of violence and aggression, but I recognize its place in history and its importance. And I would love to counterbalance the people who share my views with someone who took a very different approach so I could understand them. So maybe like a Genghis Khan, who clearly, or Attila the Hun, I'm not sure which one, but one of them, to sit down and have this conversation about whole systems design where there's a real kind of experiential body of knowledge about political and military power.
Yeah, yeah. Fabulous. Great response. Well, Joe, anybody who wants to learn more about your work, to go more deeply into it, well, where would you send them?
I would send them to Google and type in my name because I make myself easy to find. I have a new blog that I'm running now called changestrategistforhumanity.com, which is where I'm laying the foundations for creating a global research center on culture design. But I'm also like Joe Brewer 31 on Facebook or something like that. And that's where I do most of my connecting with people. But really, literally, the easiest way is to go on Google because I am a serial collaborator. And so I'm currently working with 8 or 10 organizations. I'm affiliated with, like I have my name and different job titles on lots of organizations. And it's really hard to find one that really tells my story. But you can come live my story with me if we're Facebook friends. Cool. So then we can actually partner on projects. So I would recommend people go to changestrategistforhumanity.com, click on any of the links on the bottom to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook, and we go from there.
Great, fabulous. Well, Joe, thank you so much. I just feel such a love and appreciation for you and who you are and what you're doing in the world, and I just can't wait to see you again in person. And I look forward to actually catching up on a more personal level offline at some other point.
Me too. These conversation hugs are awesome, but physical hugs are better.
Yes, amen, amen.
Well, yeah, thanks so much, Michael. It's really been a pleasure.
Great, thank you, Joe.